Well, let's take a closer look at one of those stories because if you've been watching the rundown for the last month or so, you might feel like it's been doom and gloom for our friends over at Intel. Things might be looking up though, because SoftBank announced that they are going to be investing $2 billion in Intel by buying some of Intel's outstanding shares at $23 apiece, which strengthens their partnership to advance US semiconductor technology. Both companies have said that the deal supports innovation, AI growth, and next generation digital infrastructure. That is, of course, because Intel plays a key role in US manufacturing. Of course, it's an investment, and that agreement has to be approved by the official regulatory bodies. But that might actually be something that is going to sail right through. Because if you recall last week, we were talking about the fact that there was some brouhaha with the Intel CEO and the current administration in the US. No sooner did we publish that story on the rundown than we saw a rumor floating around that the US government might buy a stake in Intel as well. And if you remember from my little political soapbox platform last week, I was wondering, well, what exactly might have been discussed in that closed door meeting? And it's starting to sound like we might have a glimpse into what it could be. But Al, before I jump back onto my soapbox platform, I'm going to let you kind of jump in here. Obviously, SoftBank investing $2 billion is going to be a big deal. Do you think it's enough, though, to right the Intel ship?
Well, I think you take it in the context of all of the things that Lip has been doing since he came on board. So he's leaned out and refocused Intel as an organization. But the problem is that the cash flow hasn't been there to fund building out something new and building that new direction out. And so this is why the deal with SoftBank is significant. Couple of $1 billion. Yeah, it's not the most massive amount of money. It's not going to build 15 new fabs all across the United States to provide redundancy in production and move away from dependency on overseas silicon foundries. But it is more of a war chest than the recent losses that Intel has been making over the last few years. And I think there may have been a little bidding war where the Trump administration wanted to use some of the money from the CHIPS Act to buy into Intel. And SoftBank was possibly a more business oriented, more tech oriented investor that might actually bring something to the party more than the Trump government would. Now, clearly, the US government is interested in making sure that things run nicely for US organizations. And there was a statement that the dependency on Taiwan based chip fabrication is a national security issue for the United States, and that particularly in light of all of the saber rattling from China around Taiwan. Of course, China claims Taiwan is just a bunch of rebels. Uh, there's definitely a thought around that risk, and that was part of the motivation for the US government wanting to invest in Intel. Uh, but I think Intel is taking the investment from SoftBank because they're much more technologically aligned, and also give them entry into markets. I mean, SoftBank's pretty strong in a whole bunch of Southeast Asian markets for Intel to sell into. So they're much more of a partner globally for Intel. But would the US government be a good investor, do you think, Tom, for Intel?
I actually think the US government would be a horrible investor for Intel because if you run a business like you run the US government, you're never going to make any money. Likewise, if you try to run the government like you run a business, you're going to fail at what a government is supposed to do. But I don't want to step onto that little box just yet because when this news broke on Monday afternoon, courtesy of the Daniel Newman of the Futurum Group, he pointed out something in just a sentence that I think underscores everything here. SoftBank has a huge investment in ARM technology. If you'll recall, SoftBank was behind the possibility of NVIDIA purchasing ARM. We covered that a lot on the rundown. Boy, could you imagine what might have happened if that deal had gone down? But I digress. SoftBank wants ARM to succeed, and they want ARM to be everywhere. They just took a $2 billion position in a company that manufactures chips. Do you think possibly they might be able to have some influence on what kind of chips get produced in all those new facilities if they're footing the bill to make sure that they get completed? I think they do. I think that they're using this as a way to diversify the arms supply chain away from TSMC in Taiwan in the event that things go south. And digressing for just a moment, if you watch any kind of political commentaries, they say that the window for any kind of resolution to the China Taiwan situation is going to occur in the next 5 to 6 years, which ironically enough is about how long it's going to take for those fabs and factories to be completed. Then there is a very real possibility that we could look at what might happen if a lot of that chip manufacturing needs to be onshored here in the US for external reasons, we'll call it that. And that could signal a very big shift at Intel because, as we know, Intel is a champion of x86 processors. Well, what happens when most of the Found series and the fabrication facilities are churning out ARM processors because SoftBank says you gotta? Well, I think it could mean that we see a wholesale shift because when you realize that most of the software that people run now is in the cloud, when you realize that half of the install base for desktops or end user devices is running on some form of an ARM chip because laptops, tablets, smartphones are all doing that. I think that the supremacy of x86 as an architecture is waning significantly. And it's one of the reasons for Intel's um, lack of market dominance. So I guess then the next question becomes if Intel's market dominance is going away and ARM is going to be facilitated by companies in Intel, does that mean that the government should stay out of it? Because here's the problem that I have with Intel taking investment from the U.S. government. You know, we've seen this before. In during the Great Financial Crisis, the U.S. government basically invested in all of the automakers in the U.S. and they used those funds as a way to bail them out, and then the automakers had to pay them back. I don't see that same kind of situation here. This isn't the government throwing Intel a lifeline to keep them from going under. It feels a little less egalitarian and a little bit more what's the word I'm looking for? Not bribery, not bribery. We already covered that. So this is totally not bribery. Maybe more self-serving would be, yeah. We don't want to say bribery, but this feels an awful lot like I'm going to put tariffs on TSMC because they're not in the U.S. and I'm going to have an investment stake in a company that is in the U.S. What do you think?
I think the tariff angle's interesting, isn't it? Is that the aim with the tariffs was to bring manufacturing back to the US, and I think that's very much the current US government's idea of deglobalization, bringing everything back to the US. But $2 billion doesn't build you a fab. Right? Silicon foundries are $10 to $20 billion to build, and then the timeline for building them is quite a lot of years. So some of me says this maybe is just a bunch of posturing to meet the current government's objectives. And, it's interesting that the investment and the turnaround in the view of the US government came from a meeting between Lip Bhutan and believe it was a closed door meeting with the president. Turnaround came there, and suddenly all of these other plans that are meeting the thoughts of the current government, but maybe they don't have to pan out. And we've seen plenty of these announced deals that don't pan out, irrespective of who's in government. Foxconn, we're looking at you in Wisconsin. There's been lots of announcements of things that are going to happen that fit the political requirements of the time, but don't necessarily pan out for the business requirements. If this had been a $40 billion stake in Intel that was enough funding to build a couple of foundries, that would have been interesting. But $2 billion, yeah, that's not building foundries, but it is giving a little more runway to Intel and also giving SoftBank a little more leverage in the US as well, giving them, making them more friendly to the US government.